Okay, so thank you all for coming. My name is Nwachukwu from CDR. We've done a collaboration with Ableton to host some panel discussions and workshops during Meltdown 2014. Thank you all for being here. I'm very happy, actually, to be sitting here. This is like, this is some weird kind of like Heads Tour Circa 95 business going on with a combination of, you know, Blue Note. We'll go into it. It'll all make sense. So, so without further ado, give it up for Curt De Giorgio, Charlie Dark, and Andrea Parker.
Yay.
So the title of this panel discussion, well, it's a conversation, because we actually want to include you guys in the conversation as well. It's basically called Circa 95, Music Creation Then and Now. And it came about because, obviously, at Meltdown, it's the James Lavelle Meltdown. And for us, we all have a connection to MOAX. We all released records on MOAX, which we'll talk about briefly. But it was quite an interesting time in terms of, not just in terms of where Clubland was at, but for those of us who were making music at a time, it was quite an exciting time. It was probably the first time that the idea of the kind of bedroom studio has really come about. A lot of sampling technology was readily available and cheap. You could go the cheap route, or you could go the semi-cheap route, but you didn't have to go out and buy an Emulator 4 or a Fairlight, you know, well, most of us couldn't afford one, obviously. But you had lots of options then. And it was kind of, to actually make music that you were listening to in clubs, it was relatively cheap and relatively affordable, and a goal that was achievable. So before I continue, I want each of you guys to kind of say who you are and what you do.
I'm Curt De Giorgio, DJ producer since about 1991, DJing a few years before then from the electro days, and I was a recording artist for MOAX. I did one album for them in 1997, which is up on the wall over there in that lovely exhibition, and yeah, I'm still doing exactly the same thing that I was doing back in the day.
My name is Charlie Dark. I'm 1/3 of Attica Blues, and we were a band that was signed to MOAX. I'm also a DJ and a writer and a poet, and more commonly known these days for my work in the running community, kind of with my Running Crew project.
Hi, I'm Andrea Parker, and I'm an alcoholic. No, sorry. I'm a DJ and producer, still from '94. Been DJing for 25 years now. Liability. Songwriter, was signed to MOAX when I did Kiss My Up in '96.
Which we'll talk more about afterwards, right? Yeah. So, we've all been making music a long time. For those of us who weren't there, just to remind everyone, so there was no internet, right? The internet was just emerging, just starting. So the whole, but Napster wasn't even a conversation, and it was just starting. CDJs weren't in clubs.
No.
Yeah?
No.
DVDs weren't readily available.
No.
I think the mobile phone had just come out.
Just about.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother.
You were the first person I knew who had a phone,
And
mobile
it's
phone.
called Techno
Yeah.
phone.
There you go, Mercury 1-to-1. Yeah, aerial with no connection. That's another story. So let's go back then. You all had setups at that point, yeah? What kind of equipment did you have? Well, explain to us your studio environment then, and what kind of tools that you were using back then.
My MOAX years would have been 96. I was signed. The album came out in 97. And I had a pretty good setup by then, because I'd been doing techno for about 5 years, quite successfully. And around the time of my MOAX album, I was also doing music for TV commercials. So I invested a lot into a pretty good studio by that point. So I didn't have a minimal setup. I had loads. I had original Fender Rhodes, original Wurlitzer, Oberheim 4-voice.
So you had a setup?
I had a big setup. I had like 10 times more then than I've got now.
And your setup is still big now?
No, it's not. I've just got a modular system, that's all. Just one thing. But it's a big thing, but it's nowhere near, you know, as diverse as what I used to have. Yeah. I think nowadays with a laptop you can do anything, you know, on a laptop. You don't even really need a modular system, anything. You just need Ableton, and that's it, to make music.
Yeah. I had an MPC some
3,000.
turntables, DJ mixer, and a very, very large record collection. And that basically was my equipment for many years. That was me.
I had an Akai sampler, 808, but not as much equipment as you. So I was lucky that I was working with David Morley at the
my
time
God.
in Bavaria, it was like an analog museum of Buchler's, Serge's, ARP 2500, 2600, incredible studio. But probably in my Mo-Wax days, I was just out recording car washes, driving down the motorway recording the cat's eyes, kitchen utensils.
So a lot of field recordings.
Yeah, lots of
beginnings,
field recordings.
And that was that to a DAT tape, right?
Yeah, a huge, great big thing.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the first time I played anything on dub plate in the Blue Note was actually on a DAT.
Oh, really?
And everyone got really freaked out that I was kind of plugging something in, and then the DAT actually didn't work after all of that. I was like, yeah, those days were a nightmare.
Yeah,
I don't even think like CDs, because we weren't even burning stuff to CDs then. Everything was like going straight to DAT.
Who brought out that really good quality portable DAT? Was it Casio?
Tascam. There's Tascam.
There's Tascam.
Yeah.
So these are some names. So let's. I mean, while we're going down the kind of the geek route, what were the signature pieces of equipment? When you mentioned Akai, so are you talking S1000?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So obviously MPC 3000, and you've mentioned things like
I had
Wurlitzer.
E4 emulator.
Okay.
E4.
So you went the EMU route as opposed to the Akai route.
Yeah, because at this time I was collaborating with Photech, and he had the Roland sampler, and then he got the E6400, and then the E4, and for me and him, the sound of the filters was the best.
That was the big debate, and it was interesting because a lot of the drum and bass producers went the EMU route as opposed to for the idea that the S1000, as the Akai sampler sounded a little bit cold, right? That was the general.
Yeah, the classic kind of filter sweep in later drum and bass is all E4.
You just had to carry so much stuff around, to a session like with Akai discs. Then the Fairlight I was using at the time, so there was a huge, great big floppy discs. So turn up to a session with
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about that because obviously, for music making now, with the exception of backing up to another hard drive, is essentially everything's in the box, right? So if you do open up an Ableton session and you hit open recent, it's pretty much exactly how you left it, right? But back then, it was a bit more involved, wasn't it?
Yeah, I had those zip drives. Remember them? Those big, thick things?
What were they? Do you remember those?
For SCSI in the back of the sampler to archive your samples.
I mean, I remember when zips came out, they were an absolute revelation. For those, basically, the zip drives were the big brother to floppy drives. So floppies you could hold, 720 megabytes, megabits or whatever.
Yeah.
And zips were, it was a little bit more storage. I think it was 100 meg you could have on one.
Yeah.
And they were a godsend at the time.
They were great, yeah.
And and if you were a big man, you had a jazz drive.
That's right, yeah.
Which is the big, which is a whole 1 gig
that,
of storage. Yeah. So you were kind of like, I remember.
Bruv, my first computer cost me £3,500 and it's got less memory than my mobile phone has now.
Wow.
I mean,
there you go. Times have changed.
It's actually amazing thinking back to that. We actually managed to make music then with the kind of the limitations that were around,
Well, the irony in the situation is, I think, and this is, I guess, something that we'll talk about a little bit more in due course, is the fact that, you have the equipment that you've got to work with, and that's what you work with, right? So in some respects,
you have
less
to work
is
harder.
Exactly, and I guess you have to be a bit more on it when it comes to preparing your sounds, but more importantly, in terms of your studio setup and documenting your writing process and actually saving your work. You have to be a bit more resourceful than just open recent,
Yeah, well, I think one of the things which was interesting about that period of time is there were probably a lot more collaborations because if you knew someone who had a Fender Rhodes, you'd kind of be like, all right, so, maybe we should make a tune together. I don't really like you, but I hear you got a Fender Rhodes, so let me come and use your, Rhodes. I think there's a lot of kind of lending of equipment to people, and kind of, I'll do a remix for you if I can borrow your, your SH101 or something like that,
Yeah, I lent you my ARP and didn't get it
did?
back for about 2 years.
That's a big story.
Big mistake.
Yeah. I should tell that
Have you
story.
still got my Kenton box?
And the thing is, I had it for a while. I had this ARP 2600 sitting in my studio for about half a year. And I used to stare at it. I've got an ARP 2600 in my studio at home. It's not mine, which is a shame. and she won't give it to me.
It's probably a good thing social media wasn't around that time.
Exactly.
So I could do plenty of naming and shaming, people borrowing equipment.
You must have.
Oh, where's that gone? What? I didn't borrow nothing off you.
So we all had setups, primarily hardware.
Yeah.
Can you talk us through perhaps some of the stages of development in terms of a typical track writing process? Given that a lot of it was hardware based, and given that there was something to do, there was the actual using the hardware, but then obviously you had to use a mixer at some point, and in turn you had to basically document the tracks, the works in progress on either DAT or cassette. So,
well, specific to my Mowax album, a lot of that was exploring modal jazz kind of, and I'm not musically trained or anything. So now I could use the scales in Ableton Push and I can just play without making a mistake. I actually had to put coloured stickers on the Fender Rhodes keys, worked out the mode that I was in, and made sure. I remember Jimpster and Jamie Odell, who is a musician, just coming round and falling on the floor laughing, just what
pink
you
stickers
do.
for mixing Dorian scale or something.
Yeah. So that's how the technology has evolved, making things easier.
Yeah. Charlie?
I remember one point I bought a 78 record player so that I could basically, because I think we were using an SP 1200 at the time, and the sampling time was like 5 or 6 seconds. So I bought a 78 record player from a second-hand shop, and I'd play my breaks in at 78, and then basically put them in, and then slow them back down to basically get them in. I mean, it was just kind of, it was an interesting time, because actually I think it was kind of, in the true essence of hip-hop, I think there was a lot of people who were kind of making music with technology that they kind of understood how to use but didn't really, and they were just making it do what they wanted it to do, So there was definitely that thing of like, you'd hear someone do something on a record, and then you kind of like be like, can you show me how you did that? It was kind of, it was really exciting times that I don't necessarily know that you get now, because basically it's so easy to make music now, and there are times when I'd be like calling you, I'll be calling people in America, being like, I've got this piece of equipment, I want it to do this, but I don't know how to do it, and having these mad long transatlantic telephone calls where people were like...
Can I ask you, did you use EQ or compression or anything technical on any of your stuff then?
Yeah, but because we were all using mixing desks, so everything was on a separate channel for a start, so you'd have I used to EQ everything separately on every tiny sound, a hi-hat, a kick. Right. Now people, they don't tend to sort of produce in that way so much, but I mean, I would start a track literally by spending hours and hours and days getting a kick from an ARP, trying to get it as fat as I possibly could until it was done, then sample it. Then, use a drum machine, get a sequence, and it was such a long process, from start to scratch, even to get it all in time.
Well, the key thing here is that the fact that we had to create our own libraries, right? Definitely. When you switch on the MPC, it's literally, it's an open canvas. So when you're recording a break-in, obviously you could have saved stuff to floppy and create your own libraries, but the idea that as soon as you switch on a piece of equipment, you're making it your own for that particular piece of, that song or that creation. So the fact that you spend like 3 days on a kick drum.
You're making your own. You're making your own sort of drum kit basically. Yeah. Now there's thousands and thousands of I
think drum libraries were definitely kind of very treasured. Yeah. Kind of people were really, really precious about kind of
kicks and booms. The 808 boom had to be really like a certain way.
Yeah, people pay good money. I remember Photech bought a DAT of breaks from Sean P.
Yep.
Who was a legendary collector of music, and there wasn't any kind of with the internet now you can get hundreds of breaks, so it was all pre that. But although I was using all this equipment, I didn't EQ or compress because I didn't know how. That's why I was asking, because I didn't know what a compressor did. Yeah. So all that stuff is uncompressed because I didn't know what it was.
Most people don't now by the sounds of it.
Because now you just, you look up
on your phone.
You can get tutorials and magazines with tutorials everywhere. In those days, things, unless you went to engineering school, those things were kind of, what's a compressor,
Well, Well, I mean, that kind of leads me on to, you know, another question. We all were essentially naive, you know, beautifully naive at that point. No, you weren't naive?
Not beautiful.
Oh, no, beautifully. Well, beautifully naive because the music was beautiful. Or dark, and, you know, beautiful in a kind of, I guess, metaphoric sense.
Yeah.
Do you think that, you know, do you think because there's, you know, we live in essentially preset culture land, it's quite easy to make tracks, you know, we can open up any door. You know, there's, you know, if you want ARP kicks, you can find them on the internet. You know, you can basically, the writing process, the personal process has been stripped out. Because we were naive then, because we were kind of like sampling things, didn't know about compression or EQ, or we learned those things later, they weren't the priority. Do you think, in retrospect, that was a good thing?
Well, that's why I kind of frown, because I don't know, I hear those records now and I just think they're terrible. They've got character, and I like what they're trying to say musically, and they've got a bit of novelty value. But, you know, from a producer's point of view, they sound pretty awful.
Charlie?
I mean, it's funny, you know, because it's basically, there are certain records that I hear from that era where I'm just like, no matter what you do now, you'll never be able to capture the vibe of those records. And I think records were just a lot more vibey then, you know.
Yeah, I like the rawness of it almost. Everything is just too clean for me a lot of the time now. People just put it all through one effect at the end and then, you know, put it onto Bandcamp or whatever. And it's almost too digital and clean. I love the old Detroit fades at the end of records and, you know, that really raw kind of sound on vinyl, which you just don't get, I think, so much now.
So I guess between then and now, it's just about making records with the equipment that you had. And I guess music now, you know, the output, how loud it sounds or how dynamic it is for a set of laptop speakers is much more important than actually, well, this is the date,
And clubs as well.
Yeah, okay.
That's why I kind of go the other way. I much prefer the production of today. They're made, a lot of them are made by people specifically for big sound systems, function ones and what have you. And I love the impact of them. And when I try and play a record with a bit of character from the 90s, they don't have the same impact for me.
So wasn't that the role of the DJ to try and create that kind of seamless listening experience?
Yeah, just have, I guess that's kind of maybe why I run a club where we only play new music. But secondly, I would probably, well, I have played old stuff and I remaster it to try and bring it up. The dynamics are pretty, you know, there's a load of peaks that, you know, could be squashed, and because people didn't really know what they were doing, and I don't know, I'm the kind of opposite. I like the new production sound.
All right.
So I like the way that people make records now. Mm-hmm. You know, I often will sit in my studio and just be laughing at just kind of, like, you can do that now? Oh my God, that's so funny. You know what I mean? It's just funny that you can do the quickness of things now.
Yeah, it's quick.
What I don't like is kind of like the genre production, where it's almost kind of like, I want to make this type of music, so let me go and buy this sound pack and put it into this software, and then 5 minutes later, it just sounds exactly like what you want it to make, and that's kind of like, I don't know. But then again, if I was 15 and I was just coming out and making music, that's probably...
that's all they know.
That's what I'd be doing. You know, I'd be on that, definitely.
So I was going to ask you guys, a show of hands, who was making music actively in 1995, 96?
Who was born?
Cool, two of us, okay.
My son is here, he's like so uninterested in anything I'm saying. The man's just in his PlayStation.
And who's making music now? Okay, all right, roughly the same then, all right. So those of you who were making music in 1995, you know, what you know, have you got any thoughts to share on this? And why have we got a microphone? Have we got another microphone?
There's one there.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, who's got some thoughts to share? Go on, you've always got thoughts to share. Yeah.
He's going to bring the mic over to you.
So one here and then one over here.
Yeah, I was just thinking. So I was around the time, obviously, when Medway first started coming out. I first read about James Lavelle in like a skateboard magazine. And like following on from that, obviously, you know, as the label grew and everything, I was buying all the records and all the rest of it. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, I look back on that time now, like you know, I was only 15, 16, 17. I'm 36 now. It's like 15, 16, 17 in like the mid 90s. But to be perfectly, obviously, you know, the technology and everything has changed. You know, it's pre-mobile, pre-internet. You know, before you know, pretty much everybody now has got a laptop or they've got a smartphone or got a tablet or anything. I mean, in some ways, I don't think you can really, it's not fair to compare kind of like stuff with then with now, from a personal point of view. And because, I mean, I still, you know, obviously I'm a lot older now, but I still think, you know, some of the stuff that was achieved at that time was pretty groundbreaking, you know, and I didn't really see it coming from anywhere else. You know, I think it was of its time, and I think it should be looked back on in that kind of way, because, you know, I don't think it was kind of unique. Whereas now everybody's got computers, everybody can download like music software, and it's like there's so much of it now. Yeah. Whereas at that time it was kind of like more of a like quality. It wasn't the quantity of stuff wasn't around so much, and it was kind of like you were more selective. If you saw an artist you really liked, you were going to get into them, and you kind of like knew why. Whereas now it's just kind of like saturated. I think that's my own point of view. I mean, I don't know what other people think, but it's kind of like...
That's a really good point, thank you.
I think it is very oversaturated. I found all my old magazines, no, not those type, the DJ Mag and all of the original sort of magazines from 25 years ago, and there was literally 3 genres of music in there. There would be like techno, house and hip-hop. Now, it's so oversaturated, you know, everything is so... I mean, I understand they have to do it for iTunes and, you know, but it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I think, I wouldn't like to be young and making music now. Because I think, well, I'm 43 years old, you know what I mean? It's like I've been making music since 84. But so it's just only because I think it's like because there are so much more people making music, and there's so much more music out, and there's so many more avenues. It's like, where do you actually start? You know, I think it's so hard. Like a lot of the kids that I mentor, the main thing is like they're making amazing tunes, but it's really difficult for them to get them heard and noticed. Whereas I think, although it was more difficult to make the music back then, if you made something that was decent.
Well, we were saying earlier that you used to, you know, you used to go into big studios, record. You know, if you were lucky to get a deal, you don't get record deals anymore, where you have to go through that whole thing of touring so much. And, you know, there's a few labels still left sort of doing that, like Warp and stuff, but it's really, you know, unless you sign, you've got to do it all yourself, haven't you? And it almost feels like it gets lost on just writing a track in your bedroom, putting it up on Bandcamp and getting a quid for it or whatever. It almost feels a bit disrespectful to, you know.
Kirk?
I think this is where MOAX can be very inspirational. And I think it's their biggest legacy. It is much more difficult to get your music out there, you know, and heard. And I think the people who succeed these days are very savvy with their creative marketing. And that's MOAX all over. They stood out from other similar kind of labels and got major label attention because James's vision wasn't just about putting records out, it was about the packaging and the little stories and the association with people like Bjork and other people like, you know, it was more a kind of lifestyle.
Experience.
And I think that's, if you have that approach to marketing yourself these days, it's personally something I'm not interested in, but that's how to get your name noticed, I think. So MOAX were ahead of the ball.
I'll definitely agree with you there. And also, you know, based on your point as well, I think, you know, what I'm thinking about, because what was really fantastic about me, you know, deciding to put this on was it allowed me to kind of remember what it was like to make records for the first time. And I think for me, just even, you know, you have to really think about that. Like the idea that you could take a break, you know, put it into a sampler, own it, you know, tune it down, whether it was like 2 cents, 10 semitones or whatever, make it kind of like some, you know, and then put some crazy noise in the sampler as well and multi-pitch that. To a certain extent, most MOAX records at the beginning were that, you know, a break, some atmospheric noise, some cuts, done. Tune done. Yeah. But that was amazing. That was exciting, you know. It was simple, but it spoke. It spoke to a generation who grew up with dance music, who grew up with hip-hop, and the possibilities were endless, you know. So I think that, you know, in a lot of respects, you know, it was a fantastic time. You know, it was a really innovative time for all of us. And also, I guess, Clubland was also as exciting and innovative. So what do you remember, what clubs do you remember from back then? And particularly when you were DJing, you know, was your music-making efforts reflective of where you were DJing and the clubs you were going to?
Now we're talking. The Blue Note. I walked into the, like, you know, obviously, because we for those of us that don't know, like Tony and I, we found a warehouse in Old Street when about 95 in Loot magazine. It was kind of an old newspaper. We kind of decamped there, and there were loads of kind of creative people from London that all lived in this massive kind of hippie commune warehouse in Old Street, in G Street actually. And I remember like the Blue Note was obviously like 5 minutes away. And I would say at that time, the drum and bass boys were the ones who were really kind of pushing the technology, and you would kind of go there and listen to these records and then come home and want to throw your drum machine out the window and just actually be a bit baffled, like, kind of... I had to look at Photech a bit differently. Like, you're a bit weird. Like, because you were making these incredible records and then you meet these people and you'd be like, you're the person that made that? It's kind of weird because now when you hear records, it's kind of like, you know, generally the person behind that record kind of suits the record that was made, but at that time, you know, you're kind of hearing Phil Hero records and expecting to meet these kind of wild dudes, and it's kind of two of the quietest dudes you've ever met in your life. You know, Photech was really quiet, but those guys are really pushing the technology and going to the Blue Note. And I think also, definitely, I think people were making music for sound systems, as in making music for specific clubs. Yeah. And I kind of went for a period like Bar Rumba had a pretty good system at one point, and I was kind of like, I remember when Plastic People was kind of like really banging it and kind of making records and being like, okay, I'm going to EQ this because it's going to sound good in that particular club, you know.
But you were playing in the posher clubs.
Where were you playing, Andrea?
Yeah, where were you playing?
Well, I was resident at Lost for 7 years.
Where was Lost?
It was all over the place, but you know they sort of did various ones. It was the main sort of techno room, which I wasn't in. I was on the graveyard shift from 4 till 7, probably to make everyone leave at that point. But it was I was playing all the B sides really to a lot of the, you know, in the main rooms, which was great because there was nowhere to sort of play, you know, a lot of the B sides, and we also used to get a lot of dub plates cut first. Before, which, you know, people now, they just, I don't know, CDs. But yeah, it was all the dirty, smelly, dark. Blue Note was really posh.
All makes sense now. Kirk?
I think I spent my mid-90s in Detroit. Lost, at Speed, Fabio's Club, Metalheads, and resident at Dusted, which was the Moax night at the Blue Note. And on Mondays...
I played there once and never got asked to play again.
Mondays I used to guest occasionally at Giles Peterson and James Lavelle's That's How It Is nights at Bar Rumba, which used to pack out a pretty decent-sized club on a Monday night. That's pretty crazy to think of now. There was a lot of students. There was a really nice, open-minded vibe there. But I think you're right, the drum and bass producers were the first guys who started tailoring the productions for the clubs. And I remember, obviously, I was collaborating with Photech, so I used to visit him and Pesce, and I was shocked that they would let someone else mix their records. Yeah. You know, they all had engineers, and it was like, oh, you know, what, you don't do it yourself? And they didn't think it was anything... like, no shame in it at all. They would say, no, he knows how to make a record. And that's when I realised how important EQ and compression and all this was. It was the drum and bass guys using trained engineers to do their stuff.
So keeping the tradition alive, even though, you know, we're kind of predominantly digital music. One thing that really springs to mind for me was the significance of recycle.
Yep.
So... Did you all use Recycle?
I couldn't have made that Moax album without Recycle.
So for people who don't know Recycle, what is Recycle?
Recycle was, I think, the first software that created a shortcut for chopping up breakbeats. Before then, and occasionally if Recycle didn't get it right, you literally had to go in and isolate every transient. Even, you know, I learned from Photech, even... keeping the bits where there wasn't a transient for the air in the break. And before you had to do that manually, which took a long time, but that's the most accurate way to get the transients. But Recycle, you loaded in your break, and it would analyze the transient points for you, cut them up, and then reassign them to individual MIDI notes. So you could then paint in with a pencil, your MIDI tool, you could paint in and rearrange the break. And that's pretty much, it just was a huge time saver.
And it's interesting because I think, you know, there's a whole generation of tracks. Someone should do a feature on that, you know, recycled tracks.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it was a game changer, you know?
It was, yeah, at the time, yeah.
I mean, I think at that time, there were particular bits of software that when they came out for 6 months to a year afterwards, once people, you know, one person would use it and people would be like, oh, okay, well, and then the next person would come and then everyone would be on it. And then basically became the thing of who could be the most inventive with that software. And then that kind of get killed off and then people would go to the next one. But I do definitely remember, like coming from a hip hop background, when first time I sat in the studio and they pulled out Recycle and they put the break in and they pressed the button and it chopped it all up, I was devastated. I thought my life was over. It was just kind of like, I just couldn't believe that basically, you know, this was happening, you know. And I think there was definitely, it's really interesting actually seeing the amount of people who stopped making music around that period of time. Because actually I think there was a lot of people who basically were like, well, if that's the way it's going, then it's not for me, you know. And I think definitely, you know, you've got a whole era of people who basically is kind of like, at that point it was even like you either got on the kind of software changes or you stayed in the kind of old school way and you basically just kind of fell off. You know, it's kind of like you just couldn't keep up with what was happening.
Yeah. Well, Recycle, you know, it created a whole new generation of producers and programmers and a whole new language, I guess, you know, whether you were a, you know, drum and bass producer or someone like me, I used to, you know, I caned off Recycle, as you know, and Fatmatic Pro, but that's a whole other conversation. Andrea, did you dabble?
Yeah, not really. I was too busy drawing beats with the Fairlight pen.
Where did you get to use a Fairlight?
I wasn't really sampling breaks though. I never really sort of sampled a lot of vinyl and breaks.
808 and just...
Yeah, I just used to use...
You're hanging out with Fairlight people.
But, yeah,
for those of you who don't know, Andrea Parker at
that
that time was just known as basically the girl with the biggest kick drum. Like, I've seen her reduce grown men to tears. Because basically you'd come on there and be like, yeah, my kick drum's going to murder your kick drum. And then she'd play you her kick drum and you'd be like, oh, man, you're like, I can't believe it was you. So there you go.
I think Andrea was lucky because David Morley was ahead of everybody when it came to equipment. He had, I mean, the trendy thing now is modular synthesizers, and he had the rarest, biggest, best collection of modular synthesizers back in the late 80s probably, with doing all the R&S records.
That's because there's nothing else to do in Bavaria.
I guess, yeah, I guess so.
Just make beautiful sine waves.
Like making sounds, not seeing
I think
anyone.
he survived just by selling one module every year.
Exactly.
It's outrageous what he had.
It was almost, he had so many like toys that he then never wrote anything because it's like you go in there, you know, it's like what do you do with that many, like, you know, toys?
But that was the kind of like the time when everyone, you know, after the Recycle thing came in and everyone started getting into plugins. And then there was a real split between those people who were kind of still using Cubase or Notator, and then people that went to Cubase, and then people who were using Logic.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, around, 95, 96, this is when, again, there was die-hard Cubase people. Yeah. But then the whole Logic audio was just about to come through, C-Lab would change to eMagic. Yeah. And it was a really interesting time. So, again, as significant as Recycle, there was Rebirth. Do you want to remember Rebirth? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. I never used that.
You never used that? You never?
No.
So Rebirth was, again, made by Propellerheads, who made Recycle, and it was the 909 and 808 and TB303 software emulation.
To be honest, it sounded thin to me. Yeah. I didn't like it.
But you had the privilege of knowing the originals.
The only thing that was good about it is there was a button that you could press and it would spin the equipment round and you could see the leads in the back. And that was like fascinating to me. Loads of us. But it was also around that time is like the thing was like became a thing of how many plugins do you have in your computer? How long does it take your computer to boot up? Was the new game. So you'd kind of go to studio and then be like, oh, I just turn my Logic on.
Of course you know who's king, right? Of course
then, you know. You'd be kind of watching the screen waiting for it to boot up, and then the longer it took, you'd be like, oh man, you're a serious producer, because like...
We had to wait for our synths to like heat up.
I think just before that was... I think one of the hugest changes in technology was recording the audio to your computer. Because before then was mostly MIDI routed to your equipment and then you routed it through a mixing desk straight to that. Yeah. the whole, and I got into that through Pro Tools, recording the audio. And
did you have a Pro Tools rig at the time?
Mind-blowing.
Did you have a Pro Tools rig?
I did. That's probably what I spent my Moax Advance on, was a Pro Tools rig. And it was mind-blowing. No one else was using Pro Tools out of my friends, so I was pretty much on my own. But when I could see that, you could, sync it perfectly, have your MIDI stuff running in time with audio that you'd already laid down, I thought, now and then I could understand what people who used to use multi-track tape were doing. And I felt like, this is a bit more like a real studio now.
So to give some context, I guess before your Pro Tools and before Logic Audio, the process of recording was pretty much real time, right? So you had your
Atari 1040
Atari,
with I think it was Opcode Vision.
Are you at the Opcode route?
Yeah,
not
I
the
was
Cubase or
no Opcode. I don't know why. I think it's because I started out with the Black Dog Productions guys, and they used that. Yeah. And
was that on a Mac, on Atari or Mac?
They're having a real geek fest
Atari,
right now.
it was the Atari.
Anyway,
we'll bring you in again, don't worry.
Vision.
This is how it used to be in the studio, because Tony would just go into the zone, and me and Rob would
Depths
just
of my memory here, but yeah. And it was all literally live. The first tracks I did were to a multi-track reel-to-reel. A two-track reel-to-reel through a mixing desk. And then to DAT. That was what it was before audio on the computer, yeah.
Well, the fantastic thing about then, you had to almost like, when you're committing to that, that's the next stage. That's almost like, okay, I'm really happy with the result now. I'm putting it to bed now.
Yeah,
do you know
exactly.
what I mean?
Decision making.
Yeah. And I guess that's something that was very much part and parcel of making music back then. You had to kind of make key decisions. You couldn't just have 20 versions of something as save as is,
Yeah, my equivalent of automation was getting the mute buttons on the Fostex mixer and just cutting in and out. But if it was good enough for Derek May, it was good enough for me. That's how he did it, so.
Cool. Okay, any responses to... There was a question over here, wasn't there? Still? Yes? Yeah.
I've got a question. You were just asking what it was like in the old times, and the reason why I was laughing was because actually I stopped making music when software or anything digital came in. So I'm from the analog world, from the early 80s, and we used to edit things with tape, and you had very clever people who could very quickly cut bits of tape. You do a bit of mix and it sounds great once you've recorded everything. And you'd be wading in knee-deep tape, making all your cuts. And you get very spontaneous effects. So the edits are not as sharp as you would get in a digital environment. And I think sometimes it's very overworked as well. People get very preoccupied with the visual rather than hearing, and they're just sort of like knitting away visually.
I agree. Yeah, because you're always looking at a screen
and
the thing rather than listening to actually the.
And I forget about the sounds. So anyway, I'm in that sort of blind analog world where I make music, and I actually listen back to some of the recordings, and they have a different sound quality. And you guys are saying, well, these days it all sounds so much better, but I do hear kind of a smoothness and a deeper bass sound, and it might be very subjective, and there are arguments about that, but I'm just astounded really about the quality of the sound despite all our primitive electronic equipment that we used. Well, so I just throw that one in, and then the Cubase came in, or the one before that, whatever, the Atari.
Pro 24, I think it was.
I thought, that's too much. I'm getting too old for all this because it's all changing very quickly, so that's why I had to giggle.
Well, the irony is, obviously, you've got a great opportunity to revisit, the equipment you were using back then, because, as you said, there's this big resurgence in modular synthesis and hardware again, right?
A couple of points to respond to that. I also did tape editing and splicing. I used to love it. A lot of the early techno records used reverse. You would reverse a bar, and then I learned that it also switched the stereo if you did that as well. So I learned quite a few things doing edits with tape. But secondly, for about 2 years now, there have been tape emulation plugins that emulate the exact characteristics of Ampex tapes and all the classic, even the Abbey Road ones, and they sound phenomenal. So that warmth that it was definitely, I agree, was missing from early digital music is definitely back now, because the non-linearity effect of tape and the saturation, they've modeled it, you know, the computers are so powerful now, they've modeled it, and I've used both, and they sound pretty much indistinguishable to me.
I think as from a DJ's point of view, another thing about that period of time is really interesting is, like, prior to kind of when, you know, the Logic switch, people were really kind of like I can't dance to that record unless it was made on an SP1200 that was plugged in the Bronx. People had this whole thing about basically like the electricity in the UK being different from the electricity in America, and that's why the records sounded different when you were mixing. That was like a thing. I remember, but I do remember definitely like around that time, people were like, actually, I don't care what it was made on. That was starting to come in. It was just kind of like, there was definitely that thing of like, and as Clubland opened up to more and more people, there definitely was the thing of kind of like, people were just like, I don't really care what it was made on or who made it.
But I think it's good to know the history of what this lady was saying. I mean, I was really lucky to be, I was given all of Daphne Aram's sounds, which she built the Aramix machine, and her archive was in Goldsmiths College, and the amount of sounds, incredible sounds that she made on that machine for that time. I mean, she's like our British, you know, sort of Robert Moog, was just incredible. And I'm not sure if I don't know if it can sound the same as it.
Hey, debate. Before we get into this match here, any pressing questions? Any pressing questions? No?
There's a lot of old men in here that really want to ask questions, but they're too embarrassed because their partners are here and they're just...
The whole
wondering.
visual listening thing is important, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's still people who prefer an MPC because they're doing everything by ear. And even with workstations, I know some people who prefer the radar because it's not screen-based, it's all audio-based.
Tape, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. So, you know, where are you guys? Where are you now, with you know, with all the expertise and experiences that you've had with music making for this time? Where you're at now?
I still sound exactly the same.
Are you using the same tools?
I still am. Apart from obviously, you know. Well, yeah, I mean, I am. I'm still using the ARP, the 808. It's just a much faster process.
And you've upgraded your operating system now, haven't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're using Live in it as well now,
yeah.
right? Yeah. And what do you use? How do you use Live?
I just record everything in live as it is. I'm still with the sort of arrangement page like it was in Cubase.
Cool, Charlie.
Well, a couple of processes. I've been actually going through a process of getting out, because I hoard equipment. Like I've never seen anything. I've got virtually every drum machine I've ever had since I first.
Still got the DR55.
I've got everything, bro. Like everything. You know, because obviously I was in like, when my son is born, he will be inheriting the studio, and you can see him there. He's just in the PlayStation. He's not interested in any of that. But anyway, I know. I'm sorry, son. I'm sorry. No, what I've been doing recently is actually getting out old equipment that I didn't really know how to use, because everyone at that time was in the kind of like, I think I read something about Ben Barton. He was like, just read half the manual and throw the manual away and basically learn how to use it that way. So that's what we all did, just threw the manual away. So I actually been like getting old equipment out and kind of re-stringing it up. And actually it's been really weird because it's kind of like learning a language in 2 days, where suddenly you really understand how that stuff works now. And so going back and using old stuff, still using Ableton, like, you know, that's been a godsend for me. But also kind of in that thing of deciding, because the thing is, I think that people make music differently.
What do you mean by that?
In the same way that, you know, like I'm a school teacher by day, so what I've realised is that people learn and take in information in different ways. Some people need to be shown physically, like I'm coming to your house and showing you how to use it. Some people you can just talk to them and they will take information that way. Some people need to know visually, so they need to go on YouTube and watch the thing and see it. What I've realised after kind of like, you know, 25 plus years of making music is I actually physically like to kind of, I'm banging you and the sound is coming out. I don't necessarily like, I'm getting the mouse and the pencil and I'm putting it in. It's just not that way. I like to program standing up and I like to basically bang the thing, and the sound is coming out because I'm a physical person coming from a DJ background. It's kind of, I find it really hard to just sit in front of the computer for days on end. I need to move the thing and dance around and feel like I'm at one with the music. So the point I'm at now is actually realizing a couple of things. The recording studio is just like an instrument. Just because you've made some music doesn't necessarily mean that anyone else has to hear it, or doesn't necessarily mean that you have to put it out. It's kind of like, you know, if you have a piano and you play some notes, you're not immediately going to record an album and do a concert. You just like playing the piano. So I actually like spending time in the studio making music that only I get to hear. Like, I love that. I love the thing of kind of, and also, with this amount of time, you know, because you've got so many different options, so you can go the analog route, you can use an MPC, you can use Ableton. So actually, it's a thing of having experimentation days where you're like, today, I'm just going to go, it's MPC, and we're chopping everything by hand, you know? Tomorrow, we're going to use Rebirth and whatever. Yeah.
Kurt?
Well, a couple of things. I think that's more of a musician's approach, and I'm not a musician, so I do the old programming in technique rather than I can't even play a bass line. More the same for 2 bars. I always get it wrong. So I prefer just to program it using step sequences or getting someone else to play it in. I'm a producer rather than a musician. Yeah. As far as what equipment, I had a big change around. I always like to stay kind of on the edge of what is happening, you know, early adopter, whatever. But a few years ago, I would say that the processing side of audio wasn't up to scratch software-wise. So I did have quite a lot of vintage Neve compressors and all these fancy EQs, you know, preamps or whatever. I had loads of those, and all the synth kind of music generating stuff was all in the computer. Now it's the complete opposite. Now they've learned how to model these EQs and compressors, tapes and everything to the standard where I think it sounds pretty much indistinguishable. So I've sold all that and I've put it all into where I think the innovation is, which is modular synthesizers. So my system, my studio is Ableton Live, every plugin under the sun, and a big modular system, and that is all I need.
So the best of modular worlds then?
Yeah.
Wonderful, cool. All right, now's your chance before we knock it in the head.
They just want to know about catalogue number MW45. And whether it had a...
All right, I think we're done.
Unless there's anything that people think we should have covered that we haven't done.
Don't be shy.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Hi. I came a bit late, so I'm hoping this hasn't been covered already. But as in regards to being producers and writers and creating music, obviously there's an idea that you're trying to get out there. But I know also sounds play a big part in I guess your individual sounds and success. And I'm wondering, do you think they are 50-50, or is it a thing where one is more important than the other, and it can kind of help the overall thing happen? Do you think you need a bag of sounds and the ideas, or is it if the ideas are there, the sounds can be compensated for?
That's interesting. Can we look at it from a circa 95 approach and a circa 2014 approach? My tuppence worth to that, I'm glad you asked that, because again, thinking about this panel, I forgot the fact that at that time there was a difference between sounds that were sampled and processed in the sampler, S3200 that I had, and I used to have a JV 1080 and a bunch of other synths. And I remember I used to make it my business to decide whether or not I want the overall track to sound like the sample. So I'd EQ the JV 1080 sounds in the context of the samples, or the other way around. Do you know what I mean? And that's something I don't really have to do nowadays. So, so is it something that you guys used to do back then? And taking on board the question, what sound considerations, what EQ sounds considerations did you have back then, and what do you have now?
That was mainly dictated by the harmonic content of the sample. I have a pet dislike, and I still can't listen to them. Some of the great techno records in particular, and even some of the early like Mowax they're out of tune. Like, they're severely out of tune. And it might sound cute and naive, but to me it sounds terribly amateurish. And I didn't know enough about music theory. If I took one of my favourite loops, which I've got many, many, I used to try and make the music fit, and I didn't know what I was doing. So I just learned to stick to drum breaks. No harmonic content whatsoever. So that dictated the sound to me. I like to just... the only samples I really used on the Moax album were drum samples. And then I would do all the music and have my own scales and stuff.
So it's almost like, to you, the sampler was a rhythm, drum machine, a rhythm component, the drummer.
Yeah, because I wasn't like someone like Premiere or, those great guys who would be able to take a loop and then they would, either get other musicians to play on them and they'd know the key, the right key and stuff like that. I was just too naive at that time, didn't know.
I think sound, ideas was really important back then. Sound maybe wasn't such a concern as much as the ideas. But I think what's happened now is because a lot of people are using very similar software, and you've also got the advent of like the sample packs, which kind of like, back in the day, if you brought a sample pack into the studio, people would be like, they were ready to fight you, it's like you spend hours trying to bend something, and then the sample pack would be sitting there and it'd be like, I'm not going to weaken, I won't open it up. Whereas now I think that, I noticed, I was on Machine. Machine, amazing Machine, you got their amazing sample library. But actually, when you're DJing a lot, you just listen to like 30 records that all sound amazing ideas, but the sounds are all the same. So actually, I think now sound is something that's going to become really important. And getting back into kind of, I'm taking the same sound or break as you, but I'm EQing it in my way. I think people are going to be a lot more, because also I think that, a lot of the kids who are making music now, they're just kind of like, okay, what do I need to do to be different? You know what I mean? If I've got to make it go on analog, what have I got to do? If I've got to go and sample my dad's record collection, everyone's very desperate to be different now because so many people are making music. As you know, when I first started DJing, I was the only DJ in my street. If I walk down my street in the summertime now, I hear like 5 different tracks coming out of different bedrooms as I walk along the road, because everyone makes music now. It's not such a special thing anymore.
Andrea?
Don't hate me, man.
It sounds it.
Kirk was about to go in on me, bro.
Sorry, I was just thinking, that's a very optimistic view that people are trying to sound different. I think people try and sound the same. They want to sound like other people.
That's what I was just going to say. I think
I'm not as
because of
optimistic
the software,
as that.
People tend to sound more the same now rather than unique. Because they're all in their budget, it's the same sort of software that they're using. And we used to experiment a lot more with sound back then because we had less, in the studio. So I would get an ARP to make it sound fat. I have to play it right down there on the keyboard all the time. Keep experimenting. Everything was about sound and EQing, compressing. Now they don't have the history of production, I find. I get sent so many demos running the labels, and there's no mids, there's no top, there just doesn't feel like there is that history.
All right, here's a question for you. Would you open up a piece of equipment now?
Well, yeah, I would.
You would?
Yeah.
You go to your shop and go and spend your big money and then come home and then open it up to see if you could just tweak it?
I would.
Yeah.
Now I would.
Go and take the push controller and open it up. And see what it does.
It's easy to do with modules, luckily. Yeah. They're open at the back, you just tweak them.
Yeah. So, in conclusion,
yes.
What are the takeaways from this experience?
I think everyone's got their own different way of doing things.
Yeah.
I'm completely the opposite how I make music to Charlie, and my philosophy is very different to Andrea's. So you can see, we've all had our own little success. So that's the thing. I think you have to find what you're comfortable with. Don't really listen to anyone else. I've worked with... Co-producing with someone else is the worst thing, because I've worked with people who say, why are you doing that? There's a keyboard shortcut for that. It's like, just leave me alone. I'm in my zone. I do things my own way. And that's what I would say. Just find your own path and do that, because everyone's different.
I would say I never realised that the kind of experiments that we were doing during the Mowax era would kind of influence other creative projects in my life. But definitely I'm kind of like, you know, I kind of look at life a bit like being a studio. It's kind of, you got to take things apart and kind of like, you know, unravel them.
While you're running 100 miles a week?
Yeah, because it's kind of, I want to push the, you know, this piece of equipment to see how far it can go. In the same way we were doing like with samplers, you know, it's kind of, don't try it because you're like super climbing girl, man. Really. So I think that basically it's kind of
to reconstruct, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, just like, you know, the idea of basically always being really curious about life and kind of experimenting and kind of seeing which works and what doesn't work and kind of, I don't, you know, the one thing I learned from that period of time is I think we were a group of young people who were basically really trying to push the envelope of what was possible, you know, and I'd like to think that now, even, you know, at the age of 43, I'm still trying to push the envelope of what's possible musically and in life in question. You know, for me, this whole Mowax thing is like, I kind of like, I'm not really, you know, so interested in then. I'm kind of interested, like, define me by what we're going to do tomorrow, not what we did 20 years ago. That's just me. Sorry, man, no one start crying and anything like that. Do you know what I mean? I love everyone here.
No, that's all good. Andrea?
I think it's sort of daring to be different and pushing boundaries. I know for me on Mowax, I was definitely the oddball on that label. And I still am now as a DJ. I still am, you know, standing up there clearing dance floors. And it's having the balls, to actually try and educate by doing something different, because it takes a lot more to stand up there. And, you know, when you know that actually they're not going to like what you're doing.
So individuality, that's what we're talking about.
Not following what everyone else is doing, which a lot of people do.
Because the thing is about Mowax is interesting is like, you know, if you look at labels like, you know, like Puff Daddy's label and kind of all the, like, you know, Rough Riders and all those kind of hip-hop labels that kind of came out that were labels that had a label sound. I wouldn't necessarily say that Mowax had like an in-house kind of sound. I think there were kind of a lot of people were kind of...
They did until I did Ball Breaker.
I think everyone was kind of like, you know, trying to be different. I don't think people like, you know, I don't think it's like you heard Shadow's record and were like, all right, cool, let's go and try and make records like him. It was very much like, okay, you made that, watch what I'm going to go and do. I'm going to make something completely opposite of what you're doing. So. But
the consciousness, I guess, was what underpinned it all. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, Kirk, Charlie, Andrea, thank you very much for your time.
No, thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you very much for everyone for coming. Nice one.